Thank you very much. I'm hitting my 30-minute timer on my watch so that I don't go over here. I want to thank Sanjay Art Center for having me back. The last time I was in this room was in 2009 before I flew to Busan and boarded a Hanjin container ship to go from the port of Busan to the port of Long Beach. So thus the title of the exhibition and my return here to Korea, from your shore to my shore and back again. So one of the photographs that you're seeing here is actually my first self-portrait when I was 9 years old from Sandusky, Ohio, where I grew up. And I would say that my work in photography hasn't changed that much since I was 9. It just became more sophisticated as I got a bachelor's and master's degree in it. But this image is in front of my house, and I feel like it still kind of represents who I am today. So from 9 years old to then now 61. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to talk about the exhibition for just a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about 3 bodies of work that have been made in the last 5 years to basically contextualize a little bit of where I am and how I'm thinking about my practice right now. So within the exhibition here in Korea, it's an exhibition that I specifically planned for the space, as well as something that I felt that I wanted to bring to Korea. And for me to think about it in some ways, I said in a recent interview the other day when I was being interviewed about this exhibition, that it's a proposition. And I look at being an artist as being an activist, as well as trying to make things that are aesthetically well-pleasing, but that also that I have the wonderful ability of working with a medium of photography that is representational. And what that begins to do and how it lays out the times that we live in and how I think about it and try to answer my own questions in my mind around that in terms of creating photography is what I did here within this exhibition. So since the beginning of time, since I picked up that first camera when I was 9 years old, it are those questions in my mind of like, well, how do I see myself? How does the world see me? How do we think about how we interact with the world? Why do some people might think that my own identity as a lesbian might be frightening to them? Or what is fear within culture? And so the proposition that I brought to Korea was bringing back the early 90s portraits that I made and doing a downstairs room of those images, such as Richard. And these dated from 1989 to 1993. And they're all photographs that I did of my friends at that time period, at a time in America in which AIDS had decimated my community. And I felt that making portraits of these, of my friends and these young queers were incredibly important and political at the time. We're at a time right now where another pandemic has hit us globally. We have lost family members. We have lost friends. We are in a world that, again, is in somewhat of a crisis in relationship to war and boundaries and borders and how we talk about this and how do we reach a greater humanity. And that is something that I thought very hard about in relationship to putting these 2 bodies of work together. So this is a portrait of my friend Rich, Robert Blanchon, right before he actually passed away from AIDS. And I wanted to really bring the kind of vulnerability, but also the notion of beauty in relationship to how these portraits function and how the entire exhibition begins to function. So with these early portraits, I was really thinking about Hans Holbein the Younger, the painter. I wanted to bring the subjects away from their bedrooms. I didn't want to do that kind of documentary photography. Even though I consider myself a social documentary photography, I wanted to have the architecture of the body and the architecture of identity begin to remain kind of just within the body, and then use these bright color seamless papers to kind of punch it out. I've had numerous questions of whether or not the colors that I choose are political. They are not. They are just simply because, like, I felt like the red heart looked really good with her lips and the red background and the chairs. So they're completely chosen on an aesthetic level. But at this point in time, my own community had never been imaged in this way. A lot of times it was body parts, it was a nipple piercing, or just the detail of a tattoo, and I felt it didn't really show the whole person. And so that was in the 90s when these were made. They were quite radical portraits of the queer community. Maybe not so radical now, but maybe radical here in Korea, I don't know. I think that in being an artist, one of the most important things is to answer those questions, and also, what does representation really do? And it's interesting because I got a letter from a friend from New Zealand today who was saying, oh my gosh, I was telling my son this at breakfast this morning, all of these younger gays and lesbians are looking at you as this like elder and thinking of you as this person who brought this to us for us to think about. And I think that when you're young, you make work that you're really passionate about. You try to do things that you might not see being out there in the world, and you want to add your voice to it. And I think it's really important for everybody to follow that. When I made this work, I really thought, oh, I'm never going to get a teaching job. You know, I've been chair now at UCLA of the art department, but I've been a professor for 30 years, tenured for 24 years. And so there were all these things that I was scared about myself in relationship to making this work. And then I just really decided that it was very important to be brave as an artist. So I often use art history. I often use the history of photography within itself, as well as painting, as well as just what's happening politically. I think about photography both being important in terms of what I was talking to you about as documentations and creating representations, but I also think that it's important to think about images metaphorically, that what is iconic, and how do we as humans all of a sudden decide, no, that flower is the perfect flower, or this is that. Like, we tend to separate and we tend to divide often into what we like and what we don't like in relationship to thinking about how a subject or a photograph is formed. And so I've always challenged that notion of what is iconic within the photographic medium, as well as then trying to create representation of those thoughts or those ideas that I want to put together. So downstairs in the gallery, there's two images. This one is titled My Shore, and then the other one is titled Our Moon. And then I'll explain why these are important in relationship to the portraits. So with My Shore, it's me looking down in the California water of the Pacific Ocean. It's the same ocean that I crossed from coming from Korea back to the port of Long Beach. But My Shore is also anybody's shore in a certain way. It's a play with language. It's a play with words. Our Moon is that. We all look at the same moon in the sky. When the moon is full, my moon is as full as your moon is full. And so by putting these two downstairs within what some people might think of as kind of radical representation of the queer community, I begin to distill this idea of obviously culturally, things can be very different within different cultures, but there still is a sameness within humanity. And so that's what I'm trying to actually propose. That's my proposition. And then when you go upstairs, you're faced with all the horizon line being in the middle, because the sky and the sea are equal, and equality should actually be a part of humanity. And so that this metaphorically begins to tie up all of the work. And while the work is here in Korea, I hope that you see it in person, because the prints and everything are so much different than what they look like on screen. I'm somebody who's a really technical photographer. I've been doing it my whole life, and I've really honed the craft, so to speak. And so please actually go, because it's all about the surface. The skin is as much about the surface as the water. So the next body of work I'm going to show you is a body of work that took 2 years to make, titled Rhetorical Landscapes. Rhetorical Landscapes comes out of the notion of rhetoric. What is language? How do we begin to think about language? How do we unpack language? And it also is a response to the Trump administration. So often Trump would say this saying of drain the swamps, right? Like drain the swamps, as if like the swamps are the worst place in the world. Swamps are really beautiful and really important part of the ecosystem. You know, they definitely delineate also a politic of the South in a certain way. I mean, you would have to absolutely talk about kind of the relationship to slavery and swamps and the South. It is a landscape that is not only a beautiful landscape, but becomes a politicized landscape also within climate change. So what you see here is an installation shot, and in the gallery there was a series of swamps that went around the room that were about 30 by 40 inches in size. And then the monitors that you're looking at on screen are actually like oversized monitors that you would find at a shopping mall. But I really like them because they look like oversized iPhones, and I wanted that kind of media relationship to what the phone is that we carry in our pocket and the height of it. And so it also becomes a figure and a portrait. So it works on those different levels. And on each one of those monitors is between a 2-minute and a 3-minute stop motion collage. And it's like done old school, like Monty Python Flying Circus stop motion collage. So that each one is about guns, about immigration, about climate change. And I've cut out for 2 years pictures from a cross section of American magazines to make these stop motion collages. And then the swamps act as this pause, as this idea of just this quiet, beautiful landscape that was being used rhetorically again in a way, and I wanted that juxtaposition. Next body of work you're going to see is 2020, and this very long piece at the end is a piece titled Monumental. And what I did was, we were driving Oliver to college, to his first year at Tulane University in Louisiana. And it was during the pandemic, but he was going to go. It was going to be in-person college. And I decided at the last minute that I should buy an RV so all of us can drive in an RV so that we would stay safe during the pandemic and be on the road. And that I would make a body of work about the kind of controversy around the monuments in America, of why they remain, why they get removed, what to look at. So the body of work is called 2020, which is also an election year. So obviously that it was before the election in which Biden won. And we're all watching now what's happening to America. And so much of my work has to do with that identity as well. And then the next body of work after 2020 that you'll look at, and one of the things about 2020 that's important is their diptychs. And their diptychs, meaning two photographs together, because I don't think that any one photograph can tell the time of what we're living in. That we need to be in dialogue. We need to be in conversation as human beings. And so the two photographs together allow a dialogue to happen between how images operate, but also how we operate as human beings. So images like this that begin to talk to each other, the upper image is actually from the Peace and Justice monument that was made in Alabama. And all of this is such an interesting piece because on each one of those metal blocks that are now at this point camera angle hanging over my head, they start off at the ground, and then as you walk down, these hang over your head. And it's each southern county with the names of the people that were lynched. And so you literally begin to feel the physicality of what that lynching was. And then below it is a monument that still remains of a Confederate monument in New Orleans, Louisiana, where my son lives. And it actually says then in spray paint, commissioned by Klansmen. So the idea of these representation of these heavy blocks then over something that still exists begins to distill that history in a certain way. So I traveled for about 3.5 weeks in the RV and made these images going all the way through the South, back up to the West Coast, to Portland, Oregon, putting together a pretty large body of work. The first piece I made was this within it called Monumental. And I view it as a poem of the moment. And then I'm not going to show you guys Rome today because my timer went off, but maybe I'll flash through the images at the end just so you can see. But the most recent body of work I'm working on right now is editing Rome. But to talk about monumental, why I wanted to create more of a poem is I was talking to you guys about how photographs for me really need to operate metaphorically. I've done a number of abstract landscapes over the years that is just simply racking the focus of the lens, because I want us to understand that photography also is memory. And we recognize these places now, and since the invention of the cell phone, we get out and we go, Grand Canyon, and then we post it on Instagram and we feel like it's all been there. But what is place to us? What does it mean for us to understand what we recognize and what we think we know, but what we also don't know? So this is my poem where the only photograph that's in focus is in the middle, and it's of the now removed Robert E. Lee monument in Richmond, Virginia. And Robert E. Lee was one of the head generals during the Civil War. And so it's a really controversial monument of what it represents in America as Black Lives Matter continues to protest, and we're looking for equality. The important part of the metaphor also within this photograph is the sun has never set on racism. So this is the exact same sunset in the sky in the beginning and the exact same sunset on the end as bookends, but I've just lowered the camera so you think the sun has lowered, but the sun remains in a fixed position in the sky. And so that was a part of the poem for me. Next photographs that you're going to see after this are actually the individual images of these, but then Rome is three components of me poking holes at the Catholic Church. It's my own trinity, which is called walls, windows, and blood. So walls, windows, and blood, just to finish up really quickly, the explanation is you looked at the panoramas, those are the outside of the walls of the Vatican. Then the windows I photographed every single window inside the Vatican Museum looking out onto Rome. And then I photographed every representation of blood, spilt blood in the artwork in the Vatican, which will end up in these grids. And so one of the things that Walls, Windows, and Blood begins to talk about metaphorically is like, okay, well, what are the walls protecting? I mean, the Vatican is a city within a city. What is transparency and how we talk about transparency culturally now? You know, what is this representation of blood actually within the art in terms of the great story of Christianity? And so I just wanted to make a body of work that I felt was really different to unpack kind of the history of the Catholic Church a little bit and just talk about representation and visibility and transparency within those three components. And that's it. Thank you. Should we leave this up as a background? Why not, right?
네, 반갑습니다. 저는 아까 소개해 주셨지만 보스코테스의 김영호라고 합니다. 사진 비평가이자 잡지를 만드는 편집자입니다. 책도 만들고 있고요. 이런 시간에 이렇게 많은 분들이 와주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 사실 이제 오늘 작가님께서 하신 강연을 바탕으로 또 이제 여러분들께서 사전에 주신 질문을 제가 조금 요약을 해서 이 시간을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 예, 장마가 지나고 이제 무더운 여름이 본격적으로 좀 시작이 되는 것 같습니다. 특히 오늘은 7월 2일인데요. 53년 전에 이제 스톤월 항쟁이 열리던 시기이기도 합니다. 한국에서도 여름이 되면 이제 자긍심과 용기를 보여주는 여러 행사들이 열리곤 하는데요. 아마 이곳에 오신 분들께서도 그런 일들을 뜨거운 여름을 준비하시거나 가시는 소수자들, 성소수자들과 비성소수자들이 많이 계시리라고 생각합니다. 여러분들께 어떤 경의를 일단 표하고 진심으로 응원하는 마음을 전합니다. 지금까지 우리가 봤듯이 작가 캐서린 오피 작가께서는 이제 자기 자신과 또 동료들의 정체성을 카메라를 통해서 질문하고 또 여러 사회적 관계에 대해서 탐색하면서 카메라가 지닌 권력에 대한 질문도 던져오셨습니다. 하지만 저는 비평가로서 이제 세계를 대변하고 있는 한 명의 작가를 어떤 정체성의 통합으로 단순하려는 욕망에 빠져서는 안 된다는 생각을 하고 있습니다. 즉 작가들은 언제나 정체성을 다 더한 것보다 조금 더 크고 약간 헐거운 존재입니다. 제가 말을 좀 길게 하는 것보다 일단 여러분들이 사전에 주신 이제 소중한 질문들을 제가 조금 요약을 했어야 이해를 할 수 있는 정도로 그것들을 먼저 여쭤보고 하는 방식으로 시작하겠습니다. 여러분들의 질문을 갖고 사실 대부분 다 작업을 하시는 분들이 아닐까 하는 생각을 좀 했습니다. 마음이 좀 급하신 분들도 많은 것 같고 그래서 맨 먼저 해설인 오피 작가님께 어떤 방식으로 작업에 대한 아이디어를 얻으시는지 또 개인 작업과 커머셜 워크를 하실 때 작업 방식이 어떻게 같고 또 다르신지에 대해 궁금하는 분들이 많았습니다.
Yeah, I mean there is a difference a little bit between the commercial work and the work because you're doing it for a client, but I think that mostly when I do fashion, they're inviting me to do it because they like the way that I make portraits. And so they often leave me alone and let me make what I'm kind of making, which I really I'm kind of weird. I mean, yeah, the clothes are great and all, but I'm kind of more interested in the people wearing the clothes and making really interesting portraits. So in terms of inspiration, I've been very fortunate as an artist that I haven't run out of ideas. I don't really know how I've been able to manage over, a lifetime of making images to still feel completely excited whenever I am making a new body of work. But I would say that a lot of the work in terms of making it has to do with a history of representation and a history of art. It's about, I view artwork as a long conversation. And I view being a part of society and a citizen in society as a conversation at all. In the same way that I was talking about those diptychs being a dialogue. That I really think that, in me, it is those questions that I ask myself in my head about what do I think about the times that we're living in? What does photography do the best at in relationship to representation? How can you do it in which it's unique, but it also extends the language? And I think so many of us as artists are always trying to think about okay, well, what is the most profound thing? What is something that people haven't ever seen before? I have to be the brightest, the best. And I think actually the longevity of a practice as an artist and the ability to move through your ideas and experiment and take chances is the most interesting way to be an artist.
두 번째 질문은 조금 더 구체적인 것에 대해 사진 촬영 현장에 대한 것입니다. 현장에서 모델과 교감을 하실 때 그들의 포즈를 설정하고 또 카메라의 프레이밍을 잡으실 때 과정을 조금 더 상세히 설명해 주실 수 있을까요? 그리고 또 인물 사진을 찍을 때 힘든 부분이 있다면 만약 당신께서도 어떤 부분인지도 궁금해하는 분이 계셨습니다.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm laughing because I asked my son, who's sitting in the front row, I said, can I tell him the story? So, one of the things about making portraits and wanting to be having a very profound relationship to making portraits for as long as I've held a camera, starting with that self-portrait when I was 9 years old. I didn't know what I was making as a self-portrait there, and I probably didn't even have the language of self-portrait. I was probably thinking oh, this is how I want to look, right? And so when people come to the studio, I'm fairly controlling except for what they wear. If it's the portraits that you've seen in any of the books on black, I tell people it's a very formal portrait. With the portraits on the colored backgrounds, it was all about that color and the way that it popped, and me thinking about Holbein and thinking about trying in the 90s to create a different kind of portrait. So different difficulties that I've run into over the years. One is, I think that at first when I started making portraits, I was not a known artist. So all the portraits that you'll see at Lehmann Maupin, they were just friends. And it was oh, Kathy's a photographer. I'm going to her studio to have the picture taken. I worked in a large format camera phase at that point. They were 4x5 inch negatives. So you go under a dark cloth. It's like very, you have to set it up, you're focusing, and then you put the holders in, and it's old school, and I was shooting negatives. And I only at that point could afford 10 sheets of film per person because I was making $8 an hour at a camera store. Like I was making no money. So I was like, I have 10 sheets to get a good portrait. And I did that for 3 years in a row. Well, I made the portraits from 1989 to about 1995, so longer actually, but I would pack up a car, I would go to San Francisco, a friend would loan me their studio, another friend would give me a bed to sleep in, and then it was, I saved enough money for X amount of colored seamless, and I would use those over and then edit the body of work. But in terms of gesture, I make people look where I want them to look. I pose their bodies. I put their hands where I want them. And I would have to say that that's why I say it's a formal portrait, is because I'm really posing the sitter. So one of the things that I always did over the years, that anybody who stood for me or sat for me, because sometimes they're sitting, sometimes they're standing, then I would give them a 16x20 print. That would be my gift back to them for them sitting for me. And so a lot of times I would give a print to my friends and they would be like, yeah, I don't really like that portrait of me. And I would be like, oh yeah, I know. It's just like, they're like, you never do people smiling, do you? And I'm like, no, I think it's kind of cliche. People smiling at a picture, don't really want to do that. And so then they would like stuff their print in the closet because they didn't like it. And then years later, I would get phone calls saying, Kathy, my print is kind of dented up and I saw myself in a museum the other day. Can you give me a new copy of it? So that would be a difficult moment where I was like, well, that paper's kind of obsolete. I mean, you should have taken better care of it. But then the difficult moment is when I was photographing Oliver. He was probably about, I don't know what, Boo, maybe 9 or so. And he had a little pet mouse named Mrs. Nibbles. And I had seen the Da Vinci show and I wanted to do the girl in the ermine, but with Oliver and Mrs. Nibbles, and put the mouse in his pocket. So, at this point I'm shooting digitally, but he was being really patient. He got dressed. He did it all for me. And then he was shoving the mouse in his pocket and the mouse bit him on the finger. And he's like, I'm done. I'm out of here. And I'm like, but I don't think I have the picture. He goes, really, Mom? I'm bleeding. So that's the most difficult moment.
사실 작가님 작업 방식에 대해서 조금 더 구체적으로 알고 싶으신 분들은 인터넷에 캐서린 오피 작가님의 인터뷰가 좀 많이 있는데요. 그중에 뮤제 매거진이라고 있습니다. MUFE 매거진. 거기에 있는 인터뷰에 조금 작업하실 때의 방식이나 고민들이 구체적으로 나와 있어서 한번 검색해 보시고 찾아보시면 많이 도움이 될 거라고 생각합니다. 조금 더 아마 여기에서 이제 힘들다고 하는 말을 캐서린 작가님이랑 우리 관객분들이 약간 다르게 사용하시는 것 같긴 한데요. 다시 한번 힘든 순간에 대한 질문이 있었습니다. 작업을
He's cracking himself up.
작업을 해나가시면서 가장 힘들었던 순간에 대한 질문이 있었습니다. 여론이나 너무 좀 비판들이나 말들, 순간들에 대해서 또 그걸 어떻게 극복하셨는지에 대한 그런 궁금해하시는 분이 있었는데요. 여쭙겠습니다.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I would have to say that the first part of the story would be an Oliver story again. And that was in 2008, I was planning a very large retrospective or survey exhibition for the Guggenheim Museum in New York, where it was 4 floors. And we were in a very intense time politically in the country again. We were going from a Bush election to an Obama White House. And there was an enormous amount of hate and homophobia being floated my way again, in a way that I didn't expect or anticipate. At that point, we did not have federal rights yet to get married in the United States, but I had felt that I had done so much work in my own community in relationship to representation, all of this different work. But I started getting hate mail in a way that really frightened me. And at one point I turned to a good friend who happened to be an actress, Gina Davis, and our kids were in school together. And I was telling her what my fears were about the Guggenheim. And Oliver at that point was 6. And I started feeling like some crazy American who hated me would come and steal my child away from me because I shouldn't have a child and I shouldn't have the right to have a child as a lesbian. I'm going to cry because it was a real fear. And I would say that was probably, I've never been afraid of making the work and putting the work out in the world, but I have always been afraid of what harm could come to my family because of the work. And why I brought up Gina Davis was because as a celebrity, she had gone through those kinds of experiences. And so she had offered for her security detail to be with Oliver during my opening so that I would feel okay about his safety. And that's why I brought her up, is like I didn't think of myself as a celebrity or somebody needing security, but after all of this hate mail, I was like really scared.
예, 지금 약간 좀 고민스러운데요. 사전 질문과 현장 질문 중에 뭘 해야 되는가 이 생각만 계속 하고 있었습니다. 그래서 여기 오신 분들 중에 마음이 급하시거나 여쭤보고 싶으신 분이 꼭 있으실 것 같아서 혹시 궁금하신 분이 있으시면 손을 들고 질문해 주셔도 좋습니다.
Yeah, we had a hand shoot up really fast. All right, I'm ready. I'm ready for you.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi.
So looking at your portrait from the 90s of your friends, I got an extreme sense of liberation just looking at candid portraits of people of the queer community, but also looking at how your work has moved on from that and reached out into all these different things and kind of a bigger scope has been liberating to look at.
Mm-hmm.
So like giving you a little context of the queer community in Korea, it's good because it's really tight and everyone's more like a family, but it's also bad because it can get suffocating. As a queer artist, like I want to and I really need to make a work about my sexual identity, but at the same time I can't help but feel limited to that, only talking about that. So
yeah, it's a great question. It's a really important question because I think that so many artists deal with the ideas around identity. And especially I think that art that you start making at a young age is often internal, it's reflective, it's what you want to put out in the world. It might also be in opposition to your family or your parents or your own community. But I think that the most important thing for every artist to remember is that curiosity and joy and interest are the ingredients of not being a singular identity. And so even though I'm a proud lesbian, that doesn't mean that I don't think about other things. I'm not thinking about, being a lesbian 24/7, I'm thinking about lots of other things. And so that singular identity was something that as soon as I got really well known for that work in the 90s, in 1994 and 95, I started making little photographs of freeways. And then that led me to the next thing, and it led me to the next thing, and it led me to the next thing. And so the most important thing for you is what are the other things that you're curious in as an artist? And how will you make work about that? And what does that mean in relationship to your own identity? And I hope here in Korea you have equal rights at some point as well. Although it looks like in the United States with this Supreme Court that my rights might be taken away again. So it's always a constant fight.
질문 몇 개 정도를 받을 수 있을 것 같습니다. 여기 아까 질문하셨던 선생님.
Okay.
선생님 바다 쇼 작품에 대해서 감명을 많이 받았고요. 제가 궁금한 거는 혹시 한국에 대해서 한국이나 한국 사회에 있어서 나타나는 독특한 문화나 이런 거에 대해서 혹시 알고 계신 게 있는지 하고 만약에 한국에서 작업을 하신다면 어떤 분야에 좀 관심이 있으신지 그게 궁금합니다.
No, that's a very good question. I had an amazing day yesterday thinking about your own boundaries and borders in the same way that I think about the horizon lines, and we went and spent the day at the DMZ. And the notion of the farming and the nature in relationship to the border was really fascinating to me. Like, what is it to think about what grows and what is given in an earth that was obviously under a place of war, and we're seeing that culturally through other countries now too, and we've watched that. I mean, what has happened at Chernobyl becoming a nature kind of weird moment in terms of what happened with the nuclear accident. And so these borders and these boundaries, in the same way of the horizon line, can we talk about them or look at them in different ways? So if I were to come back and do something here, I would imagine that I would want to spend a lot of time making nature photographs in relationship to the DMZ, but also the specificity of what that border means for you as a country. I live in California, and I watched Trump's wall go up on the Mexican border. So I'm very, very familiar with borders and boundaries in relationship to what that means culturally. And so that is something that I had never seen, but I'd always wanted to see. And you have this idea of what it looks like in your mind, but then when you're there, you're like, wait a second, like, this is incredible. Look at all the farming, and look at all of the trees, and look at all of these other things. And then to just say a little bit in terms of, I haven't spent much time in Korea, but I have lived in LA in one of the largest communities of ex-Koreans, expats, so to speak, as they call it in America. And I've, since 1988, I've pretty much have lived on the border or in the heart of Koreatown in Los Angeles. And so it feels culturally, I kind of know it in a certain way without it knowing and it being my culture.
예, 우리의 개별 질문들에 대해서 작가님께서 워낙 좀 세심하게 답변을 해주시는 바람에 5배 시간이 지났습니다. 작가님께 일단 감사드리고, 지금 리만 머핀 갤러리 8월 20일까지 캐서린 오피 작가님의 개인전이 열리고 있습니다. 그리고 또 작년에는 파이든에서 또 큰 책이 하나 나오기도 했습니다. 지금까지의 작업을 마무리한 작업을 이렇게 계속 한참 보다 보면 작가가 하지 않은 얘기도 작품이 해줄 때가 있습니다. 그러니까 아쉬워하지 마시고 전시와 책을 한번 살펴보시길 바라겠습니다. 마지막으로 우리 캐서린 오피 작가님께 그 한국의 관객들께 하고 싶은 말씀과 작업하는 분들에 대한 조언을 하나만 부탁드리는 걸로 저희 마무리하겠습니다.
Words of advice. May we all live long, and may we work hard and strive to be more humanistic. May we try to protect this one valuable piece of earth that we live on. My advice is actually to ask those hard questions. Look at what is around you. Look at your own ideas and beliefs. And if you're an artist, make work that is really, really important and meaningful for you. Because the only way to keep going on as an artist is through that curiosity and through that love and passion that you have of making things that not only please you, but hopefully pleases a larger audience. And I so appreciate you taking this time out as a protest as about ready to go through this area and be here with me this afternoon. And thank you to you both who are incredible. So appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah.